Tonight on Primetime Politics, a visit to Washington. The Prime Minister will make his second visit to the U.S. White House next week, meeting face-to-face with the U.S. President. But will we hear any big announcements? The Ottawa Bureau Chiefs will share their insights. Also,
The aim of this agency is to equip the Canadian Armed Forces with the tools and equipment they need at the speed of relevance.
breaking Ottawa's procurement logjam, retired General Andrew Leslie will give us his take on the government's new procurement agency. And
we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds.
What to take from Donald Trump's controversial speech to U.S. military leaders. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll get to those stories in a moment, but first to a developing story. According to a statement released by Hamas, the terrorist group is agreeing to release all remaining Israeli hostages. Now, that is only one of 20 points outlined in a U.S. peace deal that was announced earlier this week. Hamas now saying it wants further talks on the other points. Now, this news does come after the U.S. President Donald Trump gave Hamas an ultimatum today: accept the U.S. proposals by 6 p.m. Eastern Time Sunday, or, quote, face all hell. But again, Hamas says it will release all the Israeli hostages. We are following the story. Well, let's turn now to the Prime Minister, as Mark Carney will be making another visit to Washington this week, his second since taking office, with the PMO stating the following: the visit will focus on shared priorities and a new economic and security relationship between Canada and the U.S. Carney's first visit last spring was praised on social media by Donald Trump, but despite the enthusiasm online, that visit failed to result in any tariff relief or new trade deal for Canada. And since then, well, political insiders say Canadian officials have not established the kind of relationship that can lead to a deal with the U.S. administration, which is perhaps why the Minister for Canada-U.S. Trade is downplaying the possibility of any major developments in the near future. Take a listen to what we heard from Dominic LeBlanc earlier this week.
I learned the hard lesson of saying, oh, I think we're going to have progress in the next 3 weeks. I think we might have a deal by August, or so I have lost the illusion that we should predict in precise time when we might get to an agreement. An agreement can take many different forms. My view is an agreement is something that would improve the circumstance that we're in today. So, what can we expect from this meeting between Donald Trump and Mark Carney? Well, I asked that question of the bureau chiefs earlier today.
Well, first of all, they are right to be cautious, because Donald Trump, you never know what he's going to do next. And they were even, we knew about the trip on Thursday evening, and they let us know on Friday morning. But even then, they were nervous about announcing it, because he could change his mind and say, I don't want to meet with you anymore. I do think that the fact that the Prime Minister is going down for a working visit, that we're going to get an announcement of some kind. I think Dominic LeBlanc hinted at this in his testimony when he said, we're in the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about all the investment we're making in the United States. So, you know how this works with Donald Trump. Big and beautiful, baby. This is what he wants, right? So you've got to, we're going to bundle every kind of Canadian investment that's in the United States, and we're going to say, this is what Canada's doing, investing in the United States. We're going to have to pay some tariffs. Hopefully it's at 5 or 10%. I don't know what it's going to be. And there's going to be, obviously, a package involving national security and defense, issues like cybersecurity, AI, cutting-edge technology, that sort of stuff. So I think we're going to, one never knows, right, because you're dealing with Donald Trump. But I think overall we're going to get some kind of an agreement. And it's going to be something that Donald Trump is going to be able to say, see, we got what we wanted, and Mark Carney's going to zip his lip and let the president win.
Okay, listen, I'm going to pick up on that a bit, but quickly to you, Mia and Joël-Denis, what are your expectations for next week?
I mean, I wouldn't expect that this is the big deal to end all deals. I mean, even just this week, we saw that the United States is increasing tariffs again, this time on Canada's forest products. So we're not at the point yet where they're going to sign it all off and everyone's going to go home happy. I agree with Bob. the Prime Minister wouldn't be going to Washington if there wasn't something to do. This isn't, he, as we've heard many times, he has his cell phone. He can text him, they call, they have these calls that we just find out about after the fact. He's going for a reason. So he's going to make a big show of something. I think we have a budget coming up. There's a few announcements we're going to see ahead of that budget. This budget is a big defense budget, and the Americans obviously big on defense. It wouldn't surprise me if there is some kind of defense component to this announcement. But yeah, he's not going just to have a working meeting. There is going to be something put on the table from the Canadians.
Okay, Joël-Denis, care to guess what might be on the table?
Well, I expect something because politically speaking, you cannot go to see Donald Trump and come back from that meeting empty-handed, especially since the opposition parties have been increasing the pressure on the Prime Minister to get a deal with the United States. As Bob mentioned rightly, it's difficult to do any transaction with Donald Trump because he's unpredictable. And right now there is a situation in the United States, as you know, the budget shutdown, that complicates maybe things. That's why they were so reluctant to announce it too fast, too quickly at that meeting. And also the fact that Mr. Carney is bringing 3 ministers, cabinet ministers, along with him. Mélanie Joly, the industry minister, Dominique Leblanc, obviously the minister responsible for trade with the United States, and Tanan, the foreign affairs minister. Maybe in some of those files there will be some advance, some new deals, but politically speaking, it's a must. Mr. Carney must come back from Washington with something, otherwise he would be wasting his time and facing accusations from the opposition that he's not up to the task to deal with Donald Trump.
Yeah, because that certainly is a criticism that we have been hearing since even before the return of Parliament. Although, I want to pick up on a point that Bob was making, this idea that Donald Trump is feeling good. Like, I mean, as much as, Canada would like to say that we kind of had this elbows up strategy, Donald Trump is feeling good about the tariffs right now, so much so that he mentioned Canada and other countries and trade during his speech at Quantico on Tuesday to military leadership. Let's take a listen to Donald Trump from earlier this week.
It actually because they're having a hard time up there in Canada now because, as you know, with tariffs, everyone's coming into our country. We have more investment than we've ever had before, $17 trillion coming in. And they're coming in from Canada, Mexico, from Europe, from all over. AI, auto plants. Everybody's coming back to the United States.
Okay, so a bit of his speech, which was part of a greater controversial speech given, but still, when it comes to the tariffs applied to other countries, the U.S. president is obviously feeling very good. Bob, what does that say about the elbows up strategy? Has that failed, or are we now moving on to a charm offensive instead?
Elbows up strategy was all about election. This has nothing to do with the reality of dealing with Donald Trump or any American president for that matter. And it worked for the Liberals, and Mr. Pierre Poilievre, is doing a very good job of rubbing it in the Prime Minister's nose, rightly so. But, we're the ones that fell for this, but we have to be realistic. We're in very serious trouble in this economy. We have to cut a deal with the president because we're seeing a lot of job losses, and we run the risk of a 10%. Right now it's 7% unemployment rate. We run the risk of 10% unemployment, and so it's now Mr. Carney's turn to be very humble. And even Jean Chrétien used to say, when you deal with the Americans, you got to let them make you win.
Okay, wisdom from the ages there. Mia, what does it say about elbows up and this charm offensive? Or I don't know if you were going to call it charm offensive, but a change in tact, if you will.
I'm not sure it's a charm offensive as much as Mr. Carney. This is also sort of something he's somewhat used to in terms of negotiating. He hasn't done it as a prime minister or as at a diplomatic level before, but negotiating business to business. And I think that's one of the things that he has done to establish a rapport with Donald Trump, is to say businessman to businessman. And so he's going down there. There's a lot of Canadians that are sort of waiting, but I think the Canadians have also moved on a little bit. So not just from elbows up, but also Trump and the tariffs aren't as high because they still are worried now about inflation and affordability. So Mark Carney has a domestic problem as well as a as a Donald Trump problem. So it's not a charm offensive as much as he's kind of getting now down to the nitty-gritty of actual negotiations. And again, I say he would not be going if he didn't have something to say or something to bring back to Canada, because he needs that both with Trump and he also needs it for the domestic audience.
And those domestic issues become exacerbated if you add on to it high unemployment and people, not struggling with affordability, but struggling with the basic needs if they lose their jobs.
And I expect Mr. Carney to come with some numbers also. I'm sure that his team and the department responsible for the trade relationship in the United States are crunching some numbers. As Bob mentioned, during the committee in the Senate, Mr. LeBlanc mentioned that the Canada Pension Plan invests more in the United States than the European Union combined. So those numbers, I don't think Mr. Trump is aware of that. And Canada is about to spend a lot of money in defense. Maybe they're going to say we are, in the situation where we want to buy more armaments, more munitions, more tanks, more vehicles, and maybe some drones. So although we want to get away from the United States a bit, there's still some deals we can make in the United States. So if you bring that together, crunching numbers and defense spending that is coming up, respecting what the United States also wish that we do reach the 5%, and also access to critical minerals. This is a key point that Mr. Very key cards that Mr. Carney can play with the president, and he's aware that the United States need as much critical minerals and, wean off the dependency on China and Russia. Yeah,
and listen, I don't know if you want to say anything about this, but I will say that Donald Trump in that same speech in Quantico talked about the Golden Dome initiative as well and mentioned Canada, and in fact he said, well, Canada can be the 51st state if they want in, but that could go to what you're talking about, Bob, in terms of investment into the United States.
And look, we've all seen this from the Japanese, from the Europeans, from the South Koreans, where they have these crazy investment things in the United States, but there's nothing signed. They're just taking everything they can and saying, well, this is what we're going to do, President Trump. And he says, see, look what we've done. I've got them to invest in the United States. But nothing is written down that there's any of these investments. So there's no reason why Canada couldn't do the same thing. Hey, we're going to have billions of dollars. But whether we actually ever will, I don't know, but I think in Canada, to Canada's credit, because there's so much cross-border trade, and U.S. firms own a lot of the Canadian companies here, as well as companies in the United States, that I think the numbers can really go up if you talk about terms of investment that could very well be the kind of thing that, well, I think it is the kind of thing that the president's going to like.
Okay, so keeping a very close eye, not surprisingly, on this trip coming up next week. And that was Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Mia Rabson, Deputy Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press, and Joël-Denis Bellavance, Ottawa Bureau Chief for LaPresse. Now, we also had a lot more to say on other topics. It is part of a new podcast from PrimeTime Politics and CPAC. It is called The Bureau Chiefs with Michael Serapio. New episodes will drop each Friday that PTP is on air. You can get the latest episode now. Canada's track record on military procurement is nothing to brag about, often plagued by delays, cost overruns, and failures to deliver. But yesterday, the government did announce the creation of a new agency to expedite the acquisition of military equipment for Canadian forces. It is called the Defence Investment Agency, and it will be overseen by Stephen Fuhr, who is the Secretary of State for Military Procurement.
We need to parlay our excellence outside our own border. We don't do that very well. So, where we can partner, these are like, if you go and spend billions of dollars on submarines with another country, that's a relationship you're going to have for a long time. Can we work that relationship in other ways that benefit Canada economically and the partner that we're working with?
Well, for an assessment of this new agency, we're now joined by retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie, a former Liberal MP. From 2006 to 2010, General Leslie was Chief of Land Staff for Canadian Forces. General, thank you for the time. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Listen, it's no secret that when it comes to military procurement, Canada does not have a great reputation. And, before we talk about this new agency, perhaps we can start there. Can you, explain to Canadians out there why defense procurement has been such a challenge for this country?
I think when the chips were down during the Afghan war, Canada showed that our defense procurement system could work quickly, efficiently, and deliver the goods to where the troops needed it most. However, in the absence of that forcing function, quite frankly, I believe a lot of Canadians thought that the Americans or somebody else would be there to protect us. So the politicians for the last 15 years haven't really cared that much. Neither has the supporting bureaucracy. And to be fair, neither have the people of Canada.
So now that changes because there is, as we know, much more talk and emphasis on arming up and making sure that Canada meets its NATO targets. And in comes this new agency, the Defence Investment Agency. The government says it will overhaul and streamline the process. Do you think this entity can actually do that?
Oh, my goodness, I hope so. And by the way, I've and many others have been advocating for just such an agency because it's currently spread amongst disparate organizations with different priorities, different ambitions. And now you've got essentially one organization to bring them in. And let's not miss the fact that this is Prime Minister Carney's personal creation. So it reports directly to the top.
And did that give you more faith that it can do better than what has existed before?
Well, it certainly can't do any worse, and they won't. I'm absolutely confident that there will be some dramatic improvement because there's a fairly solid argument to be made that for the last 15 years, Canada's defense procurement system was probably the worst in NATO.
Now, you know, it's also up against, you know, the creation of this agency is up against a few realities. And ahead of the Halifax International Security Forum in November, we do know, for example, that Russia is arming quickly, that China is developing weapons quickly as well. How do you see this agency being able to meet that challenge, or at least theoretically be able to meet that challenge when Canada is playing catch up and these two big powers have already amassed great armaments?
Well, there's no doubt that we're far behind, but we appear to have the political enthusiasm. The polls show that more and more Canadians of all walks of life are much more interested in spending money on their security and their defense than ever before, at least much more so than over the last 15 to 20 years. The bureaucracy is not yet paying full attention, and that's going to be one of the biggest challenges that the team is going to face. But look, they brought in a business leader from outside, and that's a good thing, because the last thing you want is an expert in the current process, because the current process hasn't delivered. And you've got Steve Fuhr leading it, who's a fighter pilot, who chaired the Defense Committee for 4 years as a parliamentarian. He's got a lot of common sense, so I'm optimistic.
You know, General, while you're here, you know, and as we talk about procurement, of course, as a result of Donald Trump's 51st state comments earlier this year, talking about the possible annexation of Canada, you know, at the end of last year, it has many Canadians talking more and more, including the government, talking about finding other partners from whom we can buy equipment, the Europeans, the Koreans, as an example. What do you make of that strategy? Are you concerned that that might politically backfire against Canada?
I think it is illogical to continue to have 75% of every dollar that we spend on defense going straight to the United States. And it's not because they won't remain as close friends and allies and our largest trading partner, but we have to diversify. And as well, we can probably realize more jobs for Canadians if we spread our wings and fly a little bit further than we have in the past. Let's not always rely on one individual or one nation provide us the sinews of defense, in other words, the equipment, or indeed come to rely too heavily on them to defend us. We've got to do it ourselves in cooperation with others, and ergo NATO.
Is that a statement about Canada's need to be self-sufficient, or is that a statement about the changing relationship that Canada seems to be experiencing with the United States right now?
I would say it's, on balance, it's a bit of both. It's high time that we actually invested more in our defense, because we've been promising to meet a variety of commitments for the last 15 to 20 years, which we have not done. Now it's a much more dangerous and complicated world than perhaps at any other time prior to the outbreak of war and during the Second World War. And our friends and allies want to help. They want us to be a strong shoulder, especially for the North. They want to balance some of the inequities that we see with the continual interaction with the Americans recently. This too may pass, but in the interim, we've got to make sure that we defend our nation, because we can't rely on others to do it for us.
And when it comes to this agency, this newly created military investment agency, how will you judge its success or failure?
Well, unlike times gone by, it's not going to be hopefully process driven, where actually a bunch of people would gather and they're very, very pleased with themselves as a result of the process, nothing happened. I believe the Prime Minister is going to insist on results, and not only results 5 or 10 years in the future, but now, like right now, because it's a state of emergency. I don't want to overstate the complexity of the issue and the urgency involved, but there's dangerous predators on the loose, and we have to do our fair share because who knows who's next.
General Andrew Leslie, as I say, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Well, the world is still reacting to Donald Trump's controversial speech made in Quantico, Virginia this week. Delivered to the senior leadership of the U.S. military, the speech resembled the kind that is usually delivered at a campaign rally and had politicians, in particular U.S. Democrats, concerned about authoritarian undertones heard in what was said. That includes the suggestion that the U.S. military could be used against the American people.
And I told Pete, we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military, because we're going into Chicago very soon. That's a big city.
Well, with more, we're now joined by Marci Shore, professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, previously a history professor at Yale University. Marci, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin with the language used by the president. This idea that there is a, quote, enemy within the United States that the American military must fight. Now, specifically, that was in reference to protests against immigration raids, but it also comes as the U.S. Secretary of War talks about DEI and woke culture. What message do you take when you hear Donald Trump talk about the enemy within?
I would say, first of all, that the language is terrifying but not surprising. This is precisely what this administration has been building up to. My fear for a very long time has been that this is leading up to a civil war and a very strong desire to provoke violence. And that is nothing new. I mean, the summit meeting with the military leadership was disturbing on various levels. If we start from, you're flying people at enormous expense in from all over the world. It's a huge security risk. You're politicizing the military, which should not be politicized. Then you are in via Hegseth, which a kind of grotesque ritual humiliation by which you call the generals and the admirables fat, and then you make fun of people who have beards, which is just a general trope of ritual humiliation in this regime. And then you prepare them to turn against their own people, which in some ways is the logical conclusion of everything that's been happening and has been accelerated since Charlie Kirk's horrific assassination just recently.
Mm-hmm. And then add on to that, Secretary Hegseth, who you're talking about, essentially telling military leadership, this is the way it is, and you either accept it, and if you don't, to paraphrase him, he says, do the honorable thing and leave the military. So it's a lump it or leave it message from the U.S. administration. Mm-hmm. How unheard of that is that to the U.S. military in particular?
It's completely unheard of. Now, I'm not an expert on the military, but I did, after that summit meeting, talk to a couple friends who are in the military, and everybody said this is unheard of. It was not received well. It's unprecedented. It's a violation of military code and ethos on a variety of levels. Now, none of that is surprising. I mean, it's all been right in front of us, what this is building up to. But I am terrified that we are moving towards greater and greater violence. This whole administration has just been preparing the American people for increasing levels of violence.
Increasing levels of violence, and and I think it's important to point out, because you mentioned it a bit, but I do dig into this, because what we're seeing here is the U.S. administration essentially threatening to use instruments of war to fight a culture war, not necessarily a physical enemy with their own armaments, but a culture war. Is that fair to say?
It's a culture war that's become very physical. Just in the past 24, 36 hours, you had ICE and Border Patrol raiding an apartment building in Chicago that involved, dragging people, some of them naked children, out of bed in the middle of the night and tying them up and throwing them in vans, and they claim that they are looking for violent gang members and illegal immigrants, but there were plenty of children and American citizens in that mix.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have been tracking some of the reaction. Gavin Newsom, of course, as you know, is the California governor. Take a look at what he had to say on social media about this speech. He says, "It should terrify anyone who cares about our country. Declaring war on our nation cities and using our troops as political pawns is what dictators do." So that's Gavin Newsom, well-known Democrat, Marci. And I have to ask, where is the pushback on this? And I know there is some grassroots pushback. There are some politicians who are pushing back, but where's the coordinated effort to push back against what we're hearing, not necessarily everything, but certainly the authoritarian undertones of that speech?
Well, I would say, definitely, Gavin Newsom, definitely the governor of Illinois has been on it. Jamie Raskin has been on it. AOC has been on it. Jasmine Crockett. It's not that nobody is protesting. It's not that nobody has noticed. It's not that everybody is going blindly. But unfortunately, the opposition doesn't seem to be strong enough to affect a decisive turn away from this grotesque slippery slope into violence that we're on. And this entire, the preparation for violence is just saturating us. When Charlie Kirk was murdered, you can think about that in analogy to Horst Wessel's murder, to the Reichstag fire, to the murder of Sergei Kirillov in the Soviet Union. The pretext that is going to be a cause for a crackdown or an excuse for a crackdown that is going to enable a regime that has been looking for a pretext to enact large-scale violence against its own population. And I fear that's where we are. You fear this is where we are, although there will be people who hear you talking right now and say that you're being alarmist. What do you say to them? Mm-hmm. I hope I'm being alarmist. I would like nothing better than to find out that I am excessively alarmist and everything is going to be okay. I unfortunately fear that's not the case. I'm a historian, among other things, of the 1930s and totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. And the problem with being a historian is not that you know what will happen, but you know what can happen. And once you know what can happen, you cannot unknow that. And unfortunately, there are patterns here, and one of those patterns is that you prep a population for increasing tolerance of violence. And remember that America is a very heavily armed population. Even in, quote unquote, normal times, we have the highest per capita firearm possession rate in the world. And you know what Anton Chekhov said about guns. Once the gun is on the stage, it's going to go off by the end of the third act. We have a very heavily armed population, habituated to violence, to daily violence to a large extent. And this administration has been prepping people for increasing amounts of violence.
Marci, off camera, you were saying that you wish there were happier things that we were talking about, but unfortunately, this is what we're talking about right now. Listen, I appreciate the insight and the time.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope next time we will have more cheerful news.
Yeah, absolutely. You take care.
Thank you.
And that is Marci Shore. Well, that is our program for this Friday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back on Monday. Until then, have a great weekend.